A dark nebula, also known as an absorption nebula, is a molecular cloud that absorbs or extinguishes all the visible light that passes through it. To me, they are one of the most fascinating nebulae to shoot, not only because they are very challenging. How does one image something that is dark or black? But frequently we see them in images that are densely filled with stars. Recently, I decided to image LDN 1076 and LDN 1082, a region with a large absorption nebula a few degrees off from the Elephant's Trunk Nebula. Imaging was conducted over 3 separate nights. On the first and second night that I imaged this, I was having to deal with the light of a full moon, and I experimented with using a ZWO dual-band filter to scour out some of that extra light. The math says that since the moon is a broadband light source, this shouldn't work so well. Experience has taught me otherwise. The first night I was able to get 13 hours on target and about 3 hours the second night. And then, 2 nights ago, after weeks of cloud cover and rain, storms, and snow, we finally had a crystal clear night, at least until about midnight. But this far north, that gave almost 7 hours of full dark. And I pointed the telescope at that target again and gave it a full night, this time imaging with broadband. While the telescope slews, let me explain. I'm using a color planetary camera, the Player One Uranus C that I'm so fond of, because it just seems to do everything so well. And when I say I did the first 2 image sessions narrowband, what I mean is I was using a dual band filter. In fact, the ZWO dual band filter, which does a pretty good job of capturing the red and blue light side of the spectrum. And it captures 2 fairly tight bands at the same time, but they aren't really tight. Now, if you live in a city, that might not work for you so well. I live out in the country. It's a completely dark region. There are no city lights at all. And for me, that's advantageous because it allows me to catch a little bit more light. So when I say anyway that I was catching narrowband images, the first 2 images, what I mean is I was using the dual band filter on the Player One Uranus C, which uses a Sony IMX585 sensor that has a typical RGB Bayer layer over it. It's an amazing camera, and though it's designated as a planetary camera, it works wonderfully for DSOs. If you're looking for a good DSO camera, I strongly suggest trying it out. I think it's about $400 American. So the mountain slew the telescope over into the vicinity of our dark nebula, and it was a significant move, so I'm going to run the autofocus again. LDN 1076 is high in the sky right now, and a move that large can make a small but significant difference in focus. The ZWO autofocuser I am using can reveal up to 50 points worth of focus change with a large move of the telescope, when going from horizon to high in the sky, and right now that dark nebula is pretty high in the sky. Now right now I'm using a Williams Optics 81mm refractor with a 50mm guide scope. Since the guide scope has its own separate camera and its own separate optical tube, I already have guiding going. In glancing over at PhD2, I realized I need to focus the guide scope a little bit. Not tonight, I won't bother with it, but I do need to sharpen it up a little bit. Focusing guide scopes is tricky. You want the stars almost in focus, not perfectly in focus, believe it or not. Almost in focus gives a little bit of fuzz for PhD2 to work with and just helps it to handle guiding a little bit better. So yeah, next good night, I'm going to go out there and touch up the focus on the guide scope, and we'll see if that improves the guiding a little bit. Alright, now with a good focus, we're going to go back into the framing tab and check the rotation of our view. And that's because the Uranus C sensor has a more or less 16:9 layout. So unlike with a square sensor, orientation can be useful for these large targets. I have a manual rotator on the telescope, and by telling Nina to connect to the manual rotator, well, Nina doesn't have any direct control, but when I tell Nina to determine the rotation, it will run a plate-solving check and tell me the orientation of the camera. And in this case, by purely happy chance, the rotation is perfect to capture this nebula. The dark nebula at the region of LDN 1076 is very large, and this rotation captures it in a diagonal, allowing me to capture the most length possible with the sensor. And with that step of the process done, we'll run over to the sequencer tab, where I have a prepared deep sky object sequence template ready to go. All I have to do is enter some key numbers like how many exposures and how long the exposures, the gain I wanted to shoot, the offset, how frequently I wanted to check autofocus and plate solve in center, and then we're ready to go. Now this particular video is captured from the first night I was shooting on November 25th. At this time there was a substantial moon, essentially full, so I decided to image this nebula because it was on the other side of the sky, away from that moon. It definitely helps that the telescope is pointing toward a different part of the sky. It's about almost 90 degrees off from the full moon. But by some magic, that ZWO dual band filter definitely helps. I was debating with a friend recently how, but actual experiences taught me that using that filter, I can shoot on moonlit nights where otherwise, I don't know, I might just end up imaging planets or possibly not operating the telescope at all. Adding that dual band filter to my arsenal of tools has greatly increased my ability to shoot in varying conditions. I never have to deal with city light pollution, but moonlight, well, that's a formidable enemy. And while I might live in a dark sky region and enjoy Border 1 to Border 2 skies, Nova Scotia is very prone to cloud cover. When we do get a clear night, I don't want to have to forfeit it due to a full moon. So a tool like the ZWO filter, which allows me to shoot regardless, well, to me that's priceless. Now I shot this dark nebula again on November 29th, and once again I was dealing with the lights of an almost full moon. I wasn't going to spend all night on the target this night. This night, what I really had my eye on was the Leo triplet, but it wasn't going to come over the horizon till about midnight. So I took advantage of the first couple hours to run some checks and calibrations on the observatory that I had been meaning to get around to, and then spent 3 hours imaging this dark nebula again. And once again I was using the ZWO filter to help deal with the moonlight. Unfortunately, there were some very high, misty clouds, perhaps ice clouds, barely noticeable to the naked eye, but they refracted the moonlight just enough, bounced it around in the sky, that it did affect the final images. Yet amazingly, it helped. You'll see in the end. On December 9th, we had another clear night, and it was moonless. Once again, I opened up the observatory and trained the telescope on the dark nebulae region at LDN 1076 and LDN 1082. It had been so long since I had not used the dual band filter that I forgot how effective it was at calling lingering light such as moonlight or the very last of the lingering twilight, which you can see here. On this night, I'm using just the UV IR cut filter for a broadband image. The second frame, taken just 300 seconds or 5 minutes later, is pretty dark. It's not as fully dark as I want yet, so I actually ended up discarding this frame also, and it'll be another 10 minutes till I get the full darkness I'm after. But happily the telescope is all aligned and ready to go, though as you can see, there's a lot of satellites streaking through this region. So sorry flat earthers, but satellites are real, as anybody who does astrophotography can tell you, unless you think there's a conspiracy of 100 million of us or whatever. But we can see when the images become full dark, just how much more light we are gathering when we go broadband. Look at how beautiful and clear that 5 minutes exposure is. Now, what I've found and what others have reported is that broadband does give you more light and it gives you these wonderful, sharp, clear images. But by combining broadband with narrowband or dual narrowband or tri-band filters, whatever, it actually tends to make some of the colors, such as the blues and the reds, pop more. A dark nebula is already, well, an inherently dim target, so getting colors to pop will create visual interest. In truth, when shooting a dark nebula, you have 3 challenges. You are trying to image something that is dark. Imaging darkness is inherently impossible, though fortunately darkness is relative. So we can catch dark nebulae by contrasting them against stars in the background and ambient lights, as you'll see when we get toward the end of this video. Because we are working with a dark object, we're also going to have struggles with dynamic range. Dynamic range is important. Without it, images tend to look flat and uninteresting. And because this is a dark nebula, we're not going to have a lot of color to work with. What will create color interest in the final image is going to have to come from the stars. So I really want the color in those stars to pop. Now I'm pretty good with manipulating images by way of CGI, and I could add that artificially, but I don't want to. I want it to pop naturally from the light that's there. And the way to do that is to blend some narrowband and darkband imagery. So here are the results from 3 nights of shooting. Top left is November 25th. This was the night I spent all night on the image using the Broadband filter to help with moonlight. The image on the right represents the data from November 29th. There was a full moon that rose early, and though I was shooting with the exact same settings, it definitely had more of an impact on my imaging of that nebula that night. And that was due to those occasional thin clouds, I think, reflecting the moonlight. The image bottom right was the last image on this target, shot on a perfectly clear moonless night, and it shows. There was a 12% moon this night, but it wouldn't even rise till after 3 a.m., and by that time the sky was going to become mostly cloudy. So I had the telescope finished and shut down by about midnight, giving me about 7 hours total imaging on the target in broadband. Now, I should tell you that I do some professional level photo and video editing. So I'm using a 4K true-color BenQ monitor set to HDR. And all the images I developed are developed with the Adobe palette, which is much broader than the old sRGB palette, and HDR in mind. So if you're viewing this video with an older monitor, you should see acceptable color, but if you aren't using an HDR monitor, these images are going to look a little flat, and the color might not pop quite as much. At the end of this video, I'll post 2 final versions of the image, one that's calibrated for an old-style non-HDR monitor, and one that is calibrated for a modern HDR-capable monitor. Most monitors, especially those made since I think 2020 or 2021, are capable of HDR or at least HDR emulation, though from what I've read, some are not very good at it. But if your monitor does have that capability, go ahead and try turning it on. HDR gives you a higher dynamic range to work with. That means more differentiation between light and shadow, and it really helps with working with dark subjects like this. By working in HDR and the Adobe Color Palette, you'll come out with more visually pleasing images. So what we need to do going forward is integrate these 3 images. Using PixInsight's weighted batch pre-processing script, I stacked each night's data separately. I used the same calibration frames for the 2 images shot with the ZWO duoband filter, and a separate set of calibration frames for the images shot using the IR UV cutoff filter, the Broadband filter. Then, with each of these distinct masters, I ran spectrophotometric color calibration to balance the color properly and SCNR to remove the lingering green that is common to color sensors. And that was it, no further processing on the masters. At that point, the images were combined using PixInsight's image integration tool, using default settings. The final integrated master is what you might think of as the best of each discrete dataset, and it is this master that we will develop, this master where the magic will happen. All the data from the masters was useful, even the one from that night that had a few high-flying clouds that created what appeared to be ambient glow was useful. It was easily calibrated out and used in the final integration. And I think that ambient glow even turned out to be helpful, because while the majority of the ambient light in the atmosphere was muted out in the integration process, I think it provided a slight glow in the negative space between the stars. And that slight glow helped to differentiate the subtle cloud structures within the dark nebula. Now you can see that the integrated data is once again off color, and that's because of that one night with a full moon creating all of that sky glow, throwing the calibration off. So we're going to deal with that by once again running the spectrophotometric color calibration tool. And once the color is calibrated, I'll clone the image and run SCNR on the clone. Sometimes it's beneficial to run SCNR and remove that residual green. Sometimes it doesn't help. Spectrophotometric color calibration seems to have done a good job. Now we'll quickly create a clone by dragging the name of the image tab into a new space. We're going to name that clone SCNR, and then we're just going to run the SCNR process on the clone and see what it looks like. I always do this because sometimes spectrophotometric color calibration will give a great result on its own. Sometimes there's a little bit of excess green that needs to be removed. And sometimes, as in this case, SCNR doesn't help. It actually unbalances the color, which of course we don't want. So in this case, we're just going to use the image on the left, which has a great color balance after the color calibration. With emission and reflection nebulae, my next step would be to remove the stars. But I find it's often counterproductive to remove the stars from galaxies and dark nebulae. This can interfere with galaxies' light haze, and as dark nebulae are revealed by the light of the stars in the background, I find it's best to develop the stars with the nebula and focus on developing a really good balance between light and dark. It's the contrast and harmony that make the image work. So now we're going to go ahead and run through Noise Exterminator, then Blur Exterminator in that order. And while not shown, I then ran a histogram transformation to up the brightness of the image. It takes me about 10 seconds to do a histogram transformation. I simply move the furthest left marker up to where the data begins on the low side, that's the black point, and I move the midpoint marker up to where the data begins on the high point. That captures all the data and amplifies it enough to begin working with it with that last, most powerful of tools, the curves tool. We'll simply make a quick C-curve in the saturation to bring up the color. We want the stars to show good color without oversaturating them. And then we're going to make a very slight S-curve to darken the space and brighten the stars. And then finally, we end up with this. This first image is the final image calibrated for non-HDR monitors. I'm still using the broader Adobe RGB palette. This should still show up well with non-HDR monitors. The second image is calibrated for HDR monitors. HDR is going to bring out the full subtleness of changes in dynamic range, and I've let the space between the stars a little brighter because I feel it shows subtle changes in the transition of the shading in the dark nebula. Some of you might be wondering about the diffraction spikes, especially since I mentioned earlier I shot these images using a refractor telescope. As you know, with refractors you don't get diffraction spikes. This was my one capitulation to the application of CGI in an image. I like the look of diffraction spikes in some images, especially images where the stars are really important. It gives them a little bit of eye-catching variation. We humans, our perception is naturally drawn to patterns and the harmonies in patterns. And because of this, many of us just find diffraction spikes beautiful. How did I add them? With a free tool in DaVinci Resolve. And if you like, I'll go over how to do that in a future video.